Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Ellis. Welcome to the premiere of Maker Mysteries. Tonight's mystery takes place in Russia. The Dyatlov Pass incident is a famous Russian case that has confounded investigators and inspired speculation for over 50 years. The beads used in this mystery are available at jessejamesbeads.com, and tonight's mystery is sponsored by Jesse James Beads as well as the Lipstick Ranch. Let's get started. During the winter of 1959, a group of 10 students from the Urals Polytechnic Institute set out on a trek into the Ural Mountains of Russia. This large mountain range divides Europe and Asia. And despite having grade 2 hiker certifications and ski tour experience, only one of these hikers would survive. The bodies of the 9 students were eventually found on a remote mountain with horrific, unexplainable injuries. Some were semi-clothed, 2 had eyes missing, and one of the hikers' tongues was gone. Investigators were able to trace these students' journey up to a certain point through their diaries, photographs, and letters that were retrieved from the campsite. On the morning of January 25, 1959, the group arrived at the town of Ivedale by train, where they then took a truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before they went on their trek. This is where they purchased last-minute supplies to add to their already very heavy packs. On January 27th, they began their journey. But the very next day, Yuri Yudon, a member of their group, complained that he wasn't feeling well and returned to Vizhai. The remaining 9 continued on. Investigators were able to determine that the hikers hoped to make camp that night on the opposite side of what is now referred to as Dyatlov's Pass. During that day, snowstorms forced the group to travel further west. They ended up on top of a mountain that is known by the indigenous people as Dead Mountain. Rather than hike down the mountain, they set up camp on the mountain slope. Temperatures that night were very cold, -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, but the group was able to keep each other warm by sharing a single tent. This trip was supposed to take around 3 weeks and would cover 190 miles, but they never made it past that first night. They promised to send messages back home to their loved ones from their base camp. They were expected to return to this base camp on February 12th. At first, no one was surprised that they didn't make it back by February 12th. The weather on the mountains could be unpredictable and could cause major travel delays, so this wasn't unheard of. However, by February 20th, the hikers' families had become very worried, and the university set out a search party of students and teacher volunteers. After what they found, the Soviet Army got involved. On February 26th, rescuers found the group's tent cut in half from the inside. Within the tent were their belongings, including their shoes, and outside they found 9 sets of footprints by people who were only wearing socks, a single shoe, or were barefoot. The footprints led down toward the edge of nearby woods that were about 1.5 kilometers northeast of the tent. Under a large tree, the remains of a small fire and the remains of 2 shoeless bodies were found. The 2 hikers were only wearing their underwear. Branches of the tree were broken in several places, indicating that at least one of the students, maybe both, had climbed up the tree, perhaps to look back at their campsite, or maybe they were trying to get away from something or someone on the ground. One of the hikers had burns on his head and his foot and had dried blood on his face. The other hiker had similar injuries and was missing the tip of his nose. He had burns on his hands, and a chunk of knuckle was missing from his hand. Later, they discovered that this chunk of knuckle was actually in his mouth. 3 more bodies were found nearby. They were each laying several hundred meters apart, and it appeared that they had all died at separate times. Despite intense searching, rescuers were unable to find the remaining 4 hikers until May 4th, after all of the snow had melted. They were located 82 yards further into the woods from the fire that was found at that large tree. They were wearing more clothing than the other hikers, and there were signs that, as each hiker died, their clothes were taken by those who were still alive. It wasn't until the autopsies of the hikers were performed that things got really weird. One of the bodies was a brown-purple color in complexion and had unidentified gray foaming coming from his mouth and a cheek wound. However, in other reports, it is stated that this gray foam could have been an indication of a pulmonary edema. The men had several skull fractures. 2 others, a man and a woman, had major chest fractures, but none of the bodies showed any signs of external trauma. Then, just how did these strange injuries occur? A doctor that examined the bodies described the amount of force needed to create such internal injuries as being comparable to the force that would happen in a car crash. However, there were no external bruises or signs of this amount of pressure on the outside of any of the bodies. Perhaps the most mysterious finding of all was that 2 of the hikers showed evidence of radiation on their clothing. One of the women was missing her eyes and the soft tissue around the area. Her tongue and part of her lips, cheeks, and a section of skull bone were missing, and her hands were macerated. Only one of the hikers' bodies was found with no injuries. All of these baffling findings raised very troubling questions. Why were the hikers only partially dressed? Why had they cut open their tent and fled only wearing their socks or else barefoot? The official inquest into the deaths of the hikers concluded that the hikers' deaths were a result of, quote, a compelling natural force, end quote. Unaccepting of these findings, many Russians began to attempt to come up with their own explanations of what happened to the hikers, some more outlandish than others. While some speculated that an avalanche had occurred, there were no signs of an avalanche in the area. Once snow has thawed, normally an area that has an avalanche will show some telltale signs on tree trunks, and none of these trees in the area showed any of these signs. In fact, since this incident, more than 100 expeditions in the same area have taken place, and none of them have ever reported an avalanche. 2 of the hikers were studying for their master's certificate in ski instruction and mountain hiking, and so it was very unlikely that either one of them would be likely to set up camp anywhere that could be in the potential path of an avalanche. Others speculated that the hikers were attacked by local Mansi tribemen. A sudden attack would explain why the hikers had fled their tent, and it would explain some of their injuries. But the Mansi people were largely peaceful, and there wasn't enough evidence to support any human conflict, either with the Mansi tribe or even within the group itself. No footprints other than the hikers were ever found. Some even believe that the hikers were killed by a radioactive superweapon after stumbling into a secret government testing site. This would explain the radiation found on the hikers' clothing. The secret weapon explanation is pretty popular because it was partially supported by the accounts of another hiking group that was camping 50 kilometers away from the Dyatlov Pass team on the same night. This group reported seeing large orange discs floating in the sky. 2 possible explanations for the discs were that the bright orange lights were from the distant explosions of this so-called superweapon, or possible alien crafts that were testing a radioactive weapon. This hypothesis goes, the sound of the weapon drove the hikers from their tent in a panic. They were half clothed, and the first group died from hypothermia while attempting to take shelter in the forest nearby. The second group also died from hypothermia, trying to get back to their tent, while the third group was caught in a blast from further into the forest line, and they died from their injuries. The chief investigator at the time was quoted as saying, "I suspect at the time and am almost sure now that these bright flying discs had a direct connection to the group's death." However, censorship and secrecy in the USSR forced him to abandon this line of inquiry immediately. In the end, the cases of the hikers' deaths were closed with only vague conclusions, but to this day, the mystery remains officially unsolved. So what do you think?